All right, everybody. Welcome to yet another edition of the BBC, the Broadwell Broadcasting Company. We have as our guest today Snipehunter, one of the devs at SBS Soulbound Studios, and he recently released a dev journal, The Crafting Redux, which has gotten, I think last time I checked, about 126 upvotes and is one of the highest upvoted dev journals that has ever come out. And Snipehunter, thank you so much for taking the time and joining us here.
Absolutely. Wouldn't have missed it.
Excellent. We did note that on the forums you did say you might come dressed either as a red panda or a necromancer. And we're still trying to figure out which of those two you have on today. And,
yeah, I thought about it. I ultimately passed, though. I was going to use a face rig, the program that you can get on Steam, and pop in as like a wizard or something. But ultimately, I thought that was just a little too silly.
Not any problem. Yeah. Remember, you're talking to the guy wearing the plague mask. So.
Oh yeah, but that mask is dope, man.
Face rigs don't come here. All righty. Why don't we start off with just a little bit of a background on yourself and how long you've been in the gaming industry, what titles you've worked on, etc. If you can give us a little bit of a breakdown of that.
Yeah, for sure. I've actually been knocking around the industry since like 1995 or so. I got my start as a QA guy at Blizzard Entertainment on Warcraft 1. And then I was an assistant producer on the expansion pack for Warcraft 2. And then I was one of Battle.net's first community managers when it launched with StarCraft and Diablo. But what I really wanted to do was be like a game designer. And so I left Blizzard a few years later to join a little company working for Activision on a game called Third World, which I sadly never got to ship. The game got canceled. And so I found myself looking for work, and I ended up at this place called Kronos Digital Entertainment, working on a little game called Fear Effect for this new console called the PlayStation. And so my first shipping game, I was the combat designer for a sort of Resident Evil style exploration survival horror game with a really cool plot. Actually, I really, really like the Fear Effect series. It was pretty amazing. But after that, I kind of got hooked on these online games, Ultima Online, EverQuest, even The Realm or Meridian 59. And I really, really wanted to work on online games. And so I started looking at companies in the country that, were working on these games. And I found this company called VR1 Entertainment, which I had never heard of, but they had been working on like 30 different online games for various online services at the time. And they had like VR in their name. So I was like all over that, right? And so I joined them and ended up the combat designer for a quirky third-person action title launching on a new console called the Xbox that no one had heard of. And so my next major gig there was as a combat designer. And then I worked on Nightcaster 2, and I worked at that company for a little while and realized I was never going to work at an online game at this company famous for making online games. And so I went looking again. And I ended up working at a place called NetDevil on a game called Auto Assault for NCSoft, which was my first MMO. And on Auto Assault, I was the lead content designer for the Mutant faction. So I designed the major quest lines, designed the major zones for that race, designed all of their abilities and things like that. And that was my first real taste of an MMO. And I realized at that point that was basically all I wanted to work on. And so I worked on Auto Assault until it shipped. And then I ended up at a place called Tryon Worlds, working on a game called Heroes of Talara. In fact, I would end up being Heroes of Talara's lead designer. You guys probably know Heroes of Talara as a slightly differently named game, which was Rift, because that's what we ultimately shipped it as. And so I was that game's first lead designer until basically until we shipped. Actually, until a couple of months before ship. I missed the launch, unfortunately. But I actually left to come back to that NetDevil company to work on a game called Fortune Online, which was a procedurally generated online RPG, kind of like a Diablo-style game, or like Path of Exile, maybe. But all done in 2D graphics with hand-drawn animations and stuff. It was really great. We hired a bunch of comic book artists. It was an awesome project. But what I was really interested in was procedural world generation. It was something that we had started to do at Rift, which is sort of the corners of this meow concept that you'll hear Caspian talk about sometimes. And so I was pursuing that idea, working on this little game, and some folks in Denver, a place called Ilphonic, contacted me and a partner that I was working with, and they asked us if we would like to take these concepts and blow them out entirely into a new MMO, which was the MMO Revival, a project that we were working on from about 2014 to 2015, 2016. And Revival is kind of like, I like to joke that it's sort of like the heavy metal sister to Chronicles of Illyria. It's a slightly darker and grittier game, but has a lot of the same sort of like world simulation goals. It is likewise a multiplayer evolving online world. Unfortunately, Ilphonic didn't have the funding to actually finish a game like that. And so they pulled our funding and they killed production on the title. And so I find myself with a dream and no home for it. And so I remembered that COE was very similar. And so I started poking around. And as it turned out, Caspian was willing to talk to me. And we had a couple of conversations and kind of realized that we had a lot in common, that we saw the same sort of like destination on the horizon, you know, when it came to thinking about where MMOs were supposed to go. And, you know, what this meow concept, what this multiplayer evolving online world concept really is versus a traditional MMORPG. And so I interviewed for the company, and now I'm lead designer on Chronicles of Illyria.
Awesome stuff. Great info. I guess kind of like a concern that is a recurring theme that I hear both, you know, on the forums and in private chats with people, on other websites, etc. And one that I guess that you have firsthand experience with Revival, particularly since, as you say, it shares a lot of concepts with COE, is that, you know, for the amount of funding that was available, it was just too ambitious of a game. How would I phrase this? You know, how do you see the funding of COE, and do you have concerns that it also might not ship because of lack of funding, given that you have a kind of like a clearer insight into how much is needed and what is needed to produce a game with the ambitious scope that COE has?
Yeah, it's definitely something that you know is always on my mind personally. Watching Revival kind of die the way it did was hard. Like, you know, I wasn't kidding when I said, you know, I was a dream without a home at that point. We had pushed really hard to you know, realize a living, breathing online world. And, you know, we knew we weren't the only ones trying, but we thought, you know, that we had the resources necessary. And when they just sort of disappeared, it hurt. You know, it hurt the whole team. In fact, the team basically broke apart. You know, some of us went to go work on Gods of War. I'm working on Chronicles of Illyria. Other people are working at other companies. They sort of just had to spread to the winds. That was the end of it. And I think about that all the time. However, it's different with Chronicles of Illyria. We have something that Revival didn't really have. We have an active funding community. On Revival, we were operating with the reserves from Ilphonic's work, period, end of sentence. And they knew how much they had, and they knew how much they could spend, and they knew when they had hit their limit, that they had not realized their own goals, right? Like they knew when they had to kill funding. Well, it wasn't because Revival was the problem or because it was this big, you know, cash sink or anything, but rather it was because the other work that they were using to fund that had dried up. And so they found themselves in a position that they just literally couldn't afford the production. With Chronicles of Illyria, though, everything that we do is independent. We are literally, you know, funded by the community, right? Like we exist on everybody's efforts and support and hope. And that's way more powerful than the cash reserves on a work for hire game dev studio. You know what I mean? That's way more powerful, as evidenced by the fact that my God, you know, we're a few years into this already. You know, we're closer to ship than most Kickstarted titles ever get before they flame out and die. And so, yeah, I think our power is that, you know, the thing that sets us apart is the fact that we have a community, and this community is willing to support this effort. They're along for this push with us, you know, and that's what makes it work.
Gotcha. Thank you. it actually raises a ton of other questions, but I've promised to the community that we're going to be talking about the crafting Dev Redux, and if we do a stream about COE's kind of like financial model, we'll raise other questions on that. Thank you for sharing that. Let's see. Before we go too much further, I'd like to reveal today's code for our contest. The code for today's contest is the PvPers are feeling very crafty, and they'll be posting a link there in the Twitch channel. Feel free to put forward one response, hopefully a short one, that you think COE themed will best relate to that, and we'll have Snipehunter pick the winner at the end of the stream. I'll move things along because we're starting to run a little bit beyond time, behind a little bit, and that's actually, thank you for being so detailed in your responses there, Snipehunter, not a complaint. But
yeah, I am terribly wordy though.
Yeah, well, so am I. So this will probably end up being a 3-hour live stream, which isn't going to happen. So I'll try keep us moving along here. So going back to the crafting thing, I also kind of like broke my teeth on MMOs on Ultima Online back in '97. And, I've played quite a number of MMOs since. And typically, just generalizing it, the crafting systems have been very kind of like vanilla and fairly similar, with kind of like minor changes to the UI and things, how things are done. Your crafting Redux kind of like raised a whole bunch of kind of like different ideas and concepts, and therefore obviously a lot of questions, some of them flattering, some of them of concerns, and we'll try to address some of them today. But in general, using kind of like the blacksmithing thing as a following on kind of like from the theme that you had in the dev journal, in most games that I experienced, for example, if you were going to turn ore into ingots or into iron bars, it was a very simple two-step process. Basically, you place the ore and the fuel in the furnace and the forge, and then the second part is you selected ingots or iron bars as your output. You click turn on the forge, and as long as you had enough fuel in there, it spat out, bars and ingots, which you then changed into armor. With COE, instead of it kind of like being 2 steps, it's like 8 or 9 steps, and it's not as automatic as in the other games. For those that might not have been familiar with it, I'll try and run through it very quickly. First of all, you place the fuel in the forge, you light the forge, and use bellows to heat the coal. Now, the bellows will heat the coals, but there are several different heating zones within the forge, and that's differentiated by the players watching and observing the different colors of the coals, the way that they glow, the flames that they emit, and how the air shimmers above them. And basically what you do is you place the iron ore in one of those zones in the coals. With iron ore, it's not going to be too specific. I presume if it's a lower heated section of the forge, it'll just take longer to heat up, but it will eventually heat up probably. And then what you do is you monitor the iron ore, and when it's ready, it'll actually change shape slightly. It'll kind of like morph a little bit, and the color will change, and it'll emit a slightly different noise or pitch at this point in the heating process. At that moment in time, the next stage is to take a pair of tongs, take the ore, move it over to an anvil, equip a hammer in your other hand, because obviously you got the tongs and the ore in the other hand, interact with the anvil, and then you beat the ore to remove the blooms or any other impurities that are in that iron ore. And even there, you still have to kind of like interactively monitor what is going on during that beating process, because if you allow the ore to cool too much and you continue beating on it to remove all the impurities if they're not out, there's a risk that the ore will cool down too much and you might shatter it, in which case I presume that you have to take, before it gets to that point, you have to take the ore back to the forge, heat it back again until it morphs, and then bring it out. And then what you do is, once you've removed the purities kind of like to the quality that you want, you place that refined ore into the crucible. You heat the crucible to melt the iron, and then you pour the molten iron into a mold to create bars, ingots, billets, etc., whatever you're going to work with. Is that a fair kind of like summary of the process that we're looking at for crafting or refining ore in COE?
It's certainly one way to skin a cat. As you learn other techniques, you'll find that there are ways to shorten that process. That's the most basic version of it, and it's certainly the most labor intensive as a result. Part of the benefit of learning new techniques and gaining higher skill levels is that you can use them to shortcut these processes, because the recipes only care about what goes in and what comes out. The techniques that you apply in the middle that make all of that happen are in some regards up to you. You can follow the recipe, but if you know equivalent techniques, you can use other techniques instead. And in doing so, maybe save yourself a lot of time. For example, in this case, you might be able to take your ore and your flux, put it directly into your crucible, and just allow it to heat up, and then use the flux to get rid of most of the impurities in that iron. But you would have to know the technique to do so. And so, yes, that is absolutely one way to do it, but it's not the only way.
Okay, so it actually brings up a question that I think I was going to ask later, but I'll go ahead and ask it now. Are there any cues that would be apparent to know that you would add flux to the ore, versus adding something else? Or is it just a matter of, wow, I've got a smithy and I've got all the things that are in a smithy that the game allows for, and it's a matter of me throwing in one thing after another and seeing if something happens? Because you might even throw flux in, and if it's not at the right temperature, it might not work, kind of thing. How do people know? How do people learn these new techniques and recipes?
Right. The key here, when I say technique, a technique is it's both a thing that you have to do in the game, a way to play the experience, but it's also a unit of information that your character can gain or trade or teach to somebody else or learn from somebody else, right? So you can't just stumble onto a technique. You have to learn it or acquire it from something, right? That might be your own research in the research mechanic, which is something we'll have to talk about at another day. But generally, one way or another, you will gain a technique, a piece of information that is added to your character. And then you can use this technique in the experience once you have it. So if you don't have the technique, you can't use it, because there's a difference between what your character knows and what your player knows, and that's represented by possession of the technique, basically.
Gotcha. Okay, so another concern that has been brought up then is, I forget whether it was in Discord or whether it was on the forums, there was a comment made that basically recipes or techniques could either be found, purchased, or learned in game. And we know that we'll be able to purchase kind of like recipes, techniques to get kind of like a bit of a head start during exposition with EP. But I wanted to clarify whether purchasing the recipes or techniques after game launch, is that from NPCs or other players, or is that from a cash shop after launch?
Gotcha. No, there is no plan to have a cash shop after launch. All of this is in the environment, in the world of Illyria. So, another example actually that came up earlier today was a question about design experiences, right? In some of our pledge packages, there are these design experiences, and as part of the design experience, you get the recipe for the object. And the question there was, does that mean that you would also get the recipes for the components that made up the object? And if you did, would those recipes be yours, or would they just be something that you could find somewhere else in the world? And the answer is that, in the design experience, you would be in physical possession of those recipes in the game world. You would have them in your inventory, basically. And so it would be up to you to share them with the world or not. You might literally be the only person in the entirety of all of the servers of Illyria that has that recipe, which, now that I've thought about it, is kind of a heavy responsibility. Sorry, guys. But it is, legitimately on you guys to decide what you're going to do with those recipes. So that includes everything else out in the game. So there are collections of recipes in the form of recipe books, and there are collections of techniques in the form of what we call codices. And each codex is devoted to a particular type of skill, and they generally give you like a suite of apprentice level techniques within that skill. So like, for example, there's a traveler's guide to metalworking, and, you know, it'll teach you how to like basically heat stuff, how to do some basic casting, and gives you a recipe for tools and, you know, horseshoes and things like that, things that you might use on a farm or that you might make a living traveling from place to place making for people in settlements. And so if you wanted to be a smith and you had absolutely no experience and you had no one in the game who could teach you, you could find these codices and these books, and you could, you know, muddle your way through learning those or applying those techniques that you've learned from these books. But you don't get granted the skill, so it's going to be a very difficult slog without an instructor to help you, because there's no like bolstering from these books. They just grant you the knowledge. The rest of it is skill. We try to make sure that we incorporate both skill and knowledge, both on the player side and the character side, for all of our experiences, so that there are different ways for different people to decide what progression means for themselves. But one thing that we don't do is allow any of this stuff to be influenced externally once the game actually begins.
Gotcha.
There won't be a cash out.
Okay. So, wow, yeah, you're kind of like, your answers kind of like spawn more questions upon questions. So yeah, I think we'll probably be ending up going slightly over our 1 hour allotted time frame, but we'll see how it goes. So on the question of recipe books, you had mentioned in it was either, I think it was in your crafting journal, that kind of like you would open up the book to the recipe for refining ore, and that's kind of like, you know, you would know the steps. Is that kind of like a one-time process that you would do that, or does the recipe book have to be present each time you go to make something?
So you do have to have the recipe open so that the stations that you're interacting with know what you're trying to build, because it's necessary to understand success and failure, basically. But it doesn't necessarily have to come from the book. Eventually, once you've worked with a recipe or a technique long enough, you memorize them, and they just become a part of your character. And so you can open what I call the journal. We'll probably give it a million different names before we actually finish making the game. But you would open, you know, your journal, and in your journal there would be a section of the recipes that you just know, and you can just select them out of your journal, and they become the selected recipe for you to use in the crafting experience, basically.
Okay, then what happens in, I mean, given that everything can kind of like be taken, stolen, sold, etc., I'm presuming the recipe book isn't bound to your character, right? Because nothing else
Correct.
in the game is. So are you going to have to be careful when you craft that, you know, if you've just kind of like learned a new technique but you're not proficient in it, that it's not kind of like conscribed to your memory yet? You know, if you lose that recipe book or the journal, or if it gets stolen, are you basically shit out of luck?
Kind of. And as another aside too, don't forget that there's an observation mechanic too. So if you're trying to protect a technique that you haven't memorized yet, well, even if you have memorized it, you probably want to make sure that there aren't people observing you, because they might learn enough of that technique to go off and practice it on their own if they're careful about how they watch you and their own skills.
Gotcha. Okay. Or even if they take what you crafted, they can, I guess, break it down and reverse engineer. Is that a possibility as well?
So you can examine an object to determine its properties, and you can break it down to its components. So you can go, oh, I can tell that that's made out of these objects, but it doesn't actually give you the recipe. You're still going to need to acquire the recipe on your own.
And the technique.
Right. And if you don't have the techniques necessary to finish that recipe, there's just no way you're going to be able to make that object.
Okay, gotcha. That makes sense. Some other people have kind of like basically expressed concern that the skill leveling system, as it's described, is basically, it's too detailed, ambitious, involved basically, and complicated to be able to develop and implemented across all of the different skills that we have. You know, is it going to result in a significant delay in the release of the game, or are some of the skills going to be put in with kind of like very simplified mechanics, and later on they're going to be kind of like fleshed out?
Well, I mean, so I was debating with myself whether I was just going to say yes and then move on, But no, jokes aside, we've taken a lot of this into account, and there's a common framework across all of the crafting, which is this idea of, you know, techniques and recipes and skills, and the division between player skill and character skill, and player knowledge and character knowledge, that applies across all of our skill levels, or all of our skill systems, but not all of them require the same level of depth to accomplish the feeling that we're trying to get. So, you know, a really good example of that is cartography, right? The cartography experience at its core is, I want to be able to look at landmarks, understand the land around me, and build a map that represents that. The level of fidelity of that map, the things that I can include on that map, and, you know, the materials that I can use to ensure that my map is durable and things like that, are all axes of crafting that is part of the cartography skill. But the core experience of crafting is really just, I want to make a map, right? And so there's only one crafting station, for lack of a better term, that we have to deal with in that craft. On the other hand, in blacksmithing, there's the bellows, there's the forge, there's the grinding wheel, there's the anvil, there's all of the various hammers, there's all of the things you can attach to an anvil, there's the chisel, there's the tongs, right? Different crafting skills require a different level of detail in order to be accomplished right, to feel right, because that's really what matters. In my crafting journal, I mentioned verisimilitude over veracity, and that's kind of what I'm talking about here, right? We're not trying to make a perfect simulator for any of these skills. What we're trying to do is capture what each of us feels like performing these skills is like, right? And so that's a different level of detail depending on the skill. And so we've scheduled things, and we've managed things to take into account the skills that need a much deeper level of detail to accomplish that feeling versus the ones that don't. And so it's not going to be a scheduling issue. It's all accounted for in our schedule.
Gotcha. Okay. Which then raises two other questions, I guess, that I can think of right now that I want to ask. It's like, you know, using, again, smithing as kind of like as the baseline. You know, we've got a 10-year storyline, and we're looking at kind of like, you know, people being able to level up and craft and learn stuff, etc. And you know, if Chronicles of Valyria is starting off approximately, for want of a better word, in the Bronze Age, and transitioning to kind of like, you know, medieval times, or even like an early steampunk age kind of thing, there's a considerable change in the technology of armor and weapons in the Bronze Age to armor and weapons in medieval times, right? And so I can kind of like see how that's going to be engaging for those crafters. But what about people that have chosen to be candle makers or paper makers or glass blowers? I mean, basically, you know, other than perhaps a little bit of automation, and that's more so in the modern era, which is after when the timeline of the game is meant to finish on the 10-year storyline, what is going to keep a potential candle maker still engaged in his craft? I mean, you know, making a candle in the Bronze Age was, you know, maybe I'm wrong here and just ignorant on candle making, but candles aren't that much difference between the Bronze Age and the medieval age, right? Same with glass blowing or paper making.
No, I actually, yeah, I think you're not wrong about that. However, the benefit of creating our own world, you know, is that we can sort of, for lack of a better term, we can sort of correct some of these injustices. So, you know, for example, paper making is a really good one to start with, and we should get to channeling too, because that's also interesting. But paper making is a necessary skill for our game, especially with things like contracts and cartography, you know, even to a lesser degree, things like painting or producing signs. Like these will require paper. And actually, as an aside, the Toresk make armor out of paper. So paper is a big deal in our world, and that's actually what I'm getting at. In order to ensure that there are paper makers, we have to make making paper attractive. But the reality is that making paper is, I don't want to say straightforward, because that's not true, but making paper is a relatively straightforward craft in comparison to certain other crafts, and so there isn't a lot in the physical act of making paper. So instead, what we do in those cases is we fold into those skills other things that are related. So, for example, paper makers are also going to do things like bind books and print signs and print, well, I shouldn't say print because you're going to have to make a printing press first, but create signs and handbills and declarations and contracts. And so all of those skills get, put together into the role of scribe or scrivener, so that it's about creating written works, not just about making paper instead. So that there is a sort of multitude of things that you can do, a consolidation of the various acts that are necessary. And that's correct, Sally. Scribes will be paper makers. And so Chandler is a slightly different case because chandlers are they make candles. That's really kind of all they do, or at least that's how it works mostly in real life. But here, we've made our chandlers have a bit of an overlap with things like our alchemists and our first aid people, and so they can do things like make candles that provide an effect for an area, or they can do things like, instead of making candles, they can make ointments and salves and unguents that people like alchemists can use to create things like potions and other things. And so bunch of the ancillary little skills, candles are the be-all end-all technology of Illyria or something silly like that. But what we did was we looked at that role that gets played in the economy by the people who made candles and people who were similar to them, and sort of collapse them into a single skill. And that's how we deal with that problem.
Fine. Okay. That basically answers the concern that I had where I think you had mentioned in on the forums that, pretty much that whatever a player can make, an NPC can make as well, though it might be of slightly lower quality. And my concern was that, like, will it matter to somebody whether they buy a candle from an NPC or from a chandler, right? But with you now explaining, that you're going to be working in other differences, it starts to make more sense. The same with paper. I was kind of like trying to figure, what the hell difference does it make if I write my contract on a piece of paper made by an NPC or a piece of paper made by a paper maker? If I can buy the same thing from the NPC, it wouldn't make sense to me. But the way that you now have explained it, and knowing that kind of like a better quality paper might make for better quality armor for a Taurus, for example, it to me lends viability and credibility as to why somebody should take the time and effort to go ahead and kind of like progress in those skills.
Right. And to be fair, oh my God, I almost lost sight of what I was going to say. Oh no. Oh, damn it. It was about the Torres and making paper. I remember now. Sorry. I was going to say, to be fair, in some areas, at least at the start, there may be NPCs that are more skilled than the players. And while it's true that on an equal level, NPCs are probably going to make items that are, on par, but not exactly up to the perfectly same standards as a player, just because of how skill works. And, the fact that players can consciously switch techniques to add their own properties to stuff. NPCs are still going to supply a need when there isn't one there available to be fulfilled by the players too. So don't think that NPCs are always going to be inferior. There will be times in the game where, the guy who makes the potion that you need to cure a disease just happens to be an NPC because he's the only one in town with the recipe or the only one skilled enough to make it.
Yep. Yeah. Got that. So, I guess that leads on to kind of like yet another kind of like branch. We'll have to leave some of the other branches unvisited for now. But I recall, and forgive me if I kind of like get the numbers wrong on this. I'll have to scroll down to refer to my notes here. But I recall it kind of like being stated at one point that there were going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 different levels of kind of like skill. And they were going to be novice, apprentice, journeyman, expert, artisan, renowned, master, grandmaster, and legendary. And if I'm not mistaken, and do correct me on this if I'm wrong, it had been stated that basically at any given point in time, 29% of the player base in any given skill would be novice. Then 10% would be apprentice, 10% would be journeyman, 10% would be expert, 10% artisan, 10% renowned, 10% master, 10% grandmaster, and 1% legendary. Is that correct?
Yeah, that is the breakdown. Though, in fairness, it's not. So, like, hold on. Let me think of the best way to get across what I'm trying to say here.
If I can actually kind of like just carry on just for a little bit, it might help actually with your answer.
Absolutely.
The kind of like the question and the concern that that kind of like at least on the surface is apparent, and you probably have the answer for it, is how does somebody, if those are kind of like fixed percentages, right? How does somebody transition from expert to artisan? You know, if by moving up to the artisan slot, do they move somebody down from the artisan slot down to the expert slot? And now all of a sudden that person is no longer making artisan quality swords, but they're making expert quality swords. How do how do the dynamics of this work is basically what I'm asking.
Yeah, absolutely. And this actually is what I was getting at. So thank you very much. I was trying to say that we've done kind of a not great job at explaining what we mean by this, because we don't really mean that it's like, like the Highlander movies or something like that. It's not like there can be only one legendary smith. It's more like the act of attaining legendary smith is really only likely going to be possible by about 1% of the player base in any given, in any given skills like smithing, because just to get up to that level of skill, you're going to have to, learn techniques. You're going to have to practice your skills. You're going to have to track down recipes that use new techniques. You're honestly, literally going to have to travel the world. And in fact, we use the sort of trade guild sort of tiers as a representation of that, right? Like, by the time that you hit journeyman in your skills, you're really getting going. You're a smith now, you're a cobbler, you're a tailor. You're at this point going to want to advance even further, but very likely your local region is going to be tapped out for you. You're going to have learned all of the things that you can learn there, just by virtue of there being a distribution of all of this knowledge across the world. And so you're literally going to have to journey out and ply your trade elsewhere to gain the kind of exposure necessary to find the new techniques and to use those techniques to propel your skill and to, learn new recipes and try your skill against them and level up. And so by the time that you get to the things that are necessary for you to attain legendary status, by the time that you're smithing with metals no one else has ever heard of, there's not going to be anybody else standing next to you just because of the pure mountain of effort necessary. But if there was, it wouldn't be like you now had to, smith to the death to see who was best. It's not how it works. You might have a smith off to know who's best, but the system isn't going to force it on you, and you're not going to lose your crown or anything because somebody else attained it.
So would I be correct then in saying that the percentages aren't fixed, but they're more projections of where you see various people attaining to? Hypothetically, if you had a whole huge amount of dedicated smiths that all pulled their resources together in terms of sharing techniques and knowledge and recipes, that instead of there being 1% of being legendary smiths, you might have 4% of them are legendary smiths. Is that at least hypothetically possible?
Yeah, it's absolutely possible. It's unlikely unless they cooperate. But on the other hand, we're not against that idea necessarily. I mean, that's a story in and of itself. And, a big piece of what we want to do is see how we build the story together, how how you guys take this world and make it your own. And it might be that, you know, that you have the server where all the Smiths united together to become the best, and now everybody fights with laser swords or something. I don't know. I want to see what you guys do.
Gotcha. Okay. Okay, that I think kind of like, again, answers and addresses some concerns, opens up new questions, but I'll carry on with some of the other ones that I really wanted to get an answer to, and that is something that's kind of like very unique, I think, to the way that the crafting system is currently proposed, is that we're looking at having the ability to script our OPCs that in essence allow them to perform what I'll call, I don't want it taken as a derogatory term, but basically as the chore part of crafting. So that, for example, if you know how to smelt iron ore and you know how to extract the iron ore out of there and get a really high quality iron, you're not going to have to do that kind of like time after time after time unless you actually want to, in which case you have the option to do so. But you have the option of scripting your OPC to perform these chores while you're offline, so that you can then do what I would call kind of like, you know, the fun, the proactive, the challenging part of learning the new techniques and recipes. So my question on this is are resource gatherers going to be able to do the same thing for their OPCs while they're offline? Because I can see how this kind of like applies to an OPC that's standing in a smithy, and the different workstations are there, right? And all the tools are there, and presuming that he has enough of the appropriate ore and enough of the appropriate fuels and ingredients, fluxes, water to quench in, etc., I can see that taking place. How does that work, for example, somebody that's picking herbs, and herbs don't kind of like respawn or anything like that? How would a resource gatherer be able to do this chore work while they're offline?
Yeah, that's definitely the intent, is to allow it to happen. And so at the at the most course level, think of setting up your OPC kind of like setting up their day planner, right? And so you know, just using what we provide in the tools, you might say, hey, I'd like you to spend your morning over here, and I'd like you to spend your morning searching for, you know, willow bark, right? And I might, you know, designate then the local field of trees nearby or something like that. And you say, I want you to do this from, you know, the morning till roughly noontime, and then come home. And when you come home, I want you to feed the chickens, and then I would like you to head back inside and maintain your armor. And then why don't you just relax at home for the rest of the day, right? And so what will happen then, using, you know, at the next level of detail down, what happens is that each of those regions of time are then filled with NPC behaviors, which are the wants and needs for your character at the moment. And so they'll think, you know, they'll be like, you want to go here, and you want to gather this particular thing. And so the NPC systems will kick in, and they'll start to look around the area, or, you know, if they're not in the area, they'll walk to the area, then begin to look around the area for the things that they want. If they find them, they'll engage in the various experiences necessary to actually harvest them, and then take them back. And so in theory, you can basically automate anything an NPC can do, your OPC can do, and the tools are designed so that you don't have to like be a perfect down to the microsecond detailer of their behavior. Instead, you provide them motivations and goals, and then the AI system determines how to acquire them using the AI systems that we always have.
Gotcha. And would they then would they have to have kind of like a recipe book present on them to pick that, or?
Presumably you'll have already memorized all that kind of stuff before you leave it to your OPC, but if you didn't, then yeah, absolutely.
Gotcha. Alrighty. I am going to, I think at this moment in time, because we're at about the 45-minute mark, and what I want to do is to be able to turn this over to you in order to be able to answer some of the questions that our viewers we'll be posting in Twitch chat. I presume you can see the Twitch chat, right?
Absolutely. Yep.
Alrighty. Before we do that, is there anything else that you want to add? Any kind of like snippets of information? Any kind of like little Easter eggs you want to drop for us before we open it up to the viewer questions?
I think we've talked about a lot. I mean, I'm happy to answer anybody's questions, but I think I'm safer the less I leak.
We're trying to get you to accidentally leak stuff, and you can just pretend.
I did already slip to the Torresmic paper armor. I mean,
yeah, I think that was slipped on the forums, though. You can't blame us for that one.
That's a fair cop. I'm terrible at not saying what's cool about our game, I admit.
Yeah, we're trying to work on your passions here and get you to lower your guard. Alrighty, well defended, and we shall open this up, I guess, then to the Twitch questions. So viewers, feel free to go ahead and ask Snipehunter any questions that you might have. If we don't get to all of them, don't be too kind of like put off. Snipehunter has graciously accepted, as most of you know that watch us regularly, we usually migrate over to the COE Discord official for Discord and chat in there afterwards. And Snipehunter is, as I said, he said that he'll come and join us and kind of like chat with all of us in voice there for a little bit. Obviously, you know, that's an awesome thing for him to do, being that it's already getting late on in the day. And don't forget to go ahead and put in your answers for the contest if you still haven't done so. So, Snipehunter, at this moment in time, I'll turn this over to you, and it's up to you as to which questions you want to answer. All yours, mate.
All right, so I think I'm going to start with Bornes. It's a really easy question. He says, on a scale of 1 to 10, how far along is the combat system? I'm going to say about a 3. We know exactly how the combat system works. We have our mechanics, we have our systems. What we don't have is a lot of the content. You know, that takes time to produce. And so we want a massive variety of combat in the game because it follows the exact same structure as crafting. There are techniques, and the techniques are different kinds of attacks, and they're grouped under these things called stances. And so you adopt a stance, it gives you access to particular attacks, which you can then use in your attacks. And you know where your sword goes and what it hits is literally what gets hit on your person. So which armor you use to defend yourself is locational, and that matters to how your fight strategies work. And there's a big sort of complex ball that we've all worked out, but what we haven't actually done are built the hundreds of animations for all of the various attack styles, the thousands of models for all of the components that weapons are made out of, or built all of the martial codices that actually teach these skills to all the players. There's a ton of content that needs to get made, and so I'll call it a 3.
I'll actually be a little bit rude and interject here. Please tell me that you're not going to have to open up your recipe book while you're
No.
while you're doing this. It's like, no, don't hit me yet. I've got to turn to page 13 to know how to parry.
No. Actually, there's a whole system for editing your combat styles. And in fact, here, I'll leak something. At the master level, you can take the techniques you learned across any of the stances you know and build them into your own stances so that you can have your own style based out of the knowledge that you have. That's actually what you get for being a grandmaster in your particular fighting skill. But no, so what happens is in this combat editor, you basically sort of set up which stances you're going to use as accessible, via a hotkey or via a gesture on your mouse. It's kind of up to you. Just to be clear, I'm not saying we're definitely gesture based. I'm saying one of the ways that you can execute combat is with mouse movements, and so you can set up your mouse so that you can switch your stances with that if that's what you want to do. The whole idea is that it's all done on the fly.
Gotcha. Back to you to look at the next question.
All right, so Prody had a question. I got to scroll back and find it. I apologize, but it was a good one, and it was about alchemy. Where are you? Where did you go, Prody? All right, well, I guess I lost the question, but Prody was asking are we going to have potions that will have effects that can either increase your maximum energy or provide extra energy or, oh, there we go. are there going to be potions that we can make that replenish energy or stamina or raise energy or stamina recovery rates? And the answer is absolutely yes. So there are two aspects to maintaining your sort of like energy level. Part of that is eating regularly so that you're not starving, drinking so that you're not, you're not super thirsty, you're not dehydrated. But then the other half of that is things like using potions or particularly well-made foods that provide effects that can do things like temporarily provide an extra boost of energy. Energy is sort of our like fast action fuel, right? So certain combat moves might require that it takes energy from you, and you can only perform so many combat attacks before you run out of energy and you have to sort of get your breath back. But if you were to drug yourself up with some of these potions from an alchemist, you might be able to exceed your normal limits at a cost. That's absolutely part of the game.
Alrighty, drug pushes in COE confirmed, I guess, huh?
Absolutely.
Alrighty. Do you have another question there that you see that you want to answer? As I say, I don't have Twitch up, so.
Let's see. Nelanie asks, when it comes to crafting, I know that we already have different tribes knowing different skills. So would it be possible to be from a completely different tribe and learn how they craft an item that is different from what is normally used by your tribe? Absolutely. In fact, earlier I had been talking about how you're going to have to travel the world to really advance your skills past a particular level. And this is kind of what I mean. So, let's talk about scribes and Toresk paper armor, for example. The only people when the game launches that are going to know how to do that are the Toresk themselves. If you're interested, you're going to have to travel to Toresk lands, find a Toresk scribe who's willing to teach you or allow you to observe them so that you can muddle through learning it yourself through observation, these skills. Otherwise, they're going to be the only people in the entire server ever who can do that. You guys are going to have to seek out the knowledge yourselves.
So if I'm, for example, in the Broodveer kingdom, right? In the Broodveer, I think it's Broodveer Hrothi kingdom.
Right.
If I'm there and that's the kingdom that I choose to play in and I roll a Toresk tune, and I want to be a scribe, am I going to be able to discover how to do that myself, or am I actually going to physically have to journey down, even as a Toresk, down to Toresk lands to learn those techniques? Or will, through experimentation, will I, as a scribe, be able to learn them up in the Broodveer Hrothi lands?
Chances are you're going to have to go find them yourself as well. There are some exceptions to that. Like, for example, you could arrive at paper armor through the research mechanic as a scribe if you were pushing that system that way. And we haven't talked a lot about research, and I'm not really ready to talk about it, so I'm going to sort of hand wave about that a little bit. But the idea is that if you know a thing exists in the world and you understand, some sort of element about how that's made, you can use the research mechanic to try to get there yourself. And so potentially you could do that through the research mechanic, but that is a hard slog, and it might be just easier to risk the trip down to, the Toresk lands and hit up some stilt houses and talk to some scribes.
Understood. All righty. For those of you that have posed questions that haven't been answered, don't despair. We're almost at the end of our 1 hour limit that I like to put on our live streams. As I mentioned before, Snipe is going to be joining us in the COE Discord channel, and you'll have an opportunity to actually ask him directly, but rather than texting it here. So Snipe, if you can take a couple of moments here and pick out who you think the winner of our contest is. And once again, the phrase that we were looking at is the PvPers are trying to be very crafty.
All right, so I don't know who wrote these, but I think that the winner is actually the shortest and sweetest of them all, and it is simply, how did they get over my damn walls again?
Fair enough. We will have on our little Google database doc the name of the person that won that, and we'll get in contact with them and get them their choice of the prize of 100 EP or a kingdom or a village token.
Aha, that was Butter 101, by the way. Apologies for not mentioning that earlier.
Excellent stuff.
Butter 201, excuse me.
201. Alrighty. So I think that that wraps us up. We're pretty much at the 1 hour mark. Obviously want to thank you tremendously for taking your time out. I know your devs don't often come on the live streams and stuff like that. So for taking time out from your schedule and letting us kind of like, grill you a little bit on some of the concerns and questions we had within the community regarding the thing, as well as kind of like, I think just find out so much more about what's going on kind of like in you guys' thought process, and actually not just the thought process but the development process as well of crafting. It was great
Yeah, no
pleasure
problem,
to have
man.
you on. Alrighty, so everybody, we are going to be closing the live stream down here in around about a minute, and we're going to be migrating over to the COE Discord, and we shall see you over there in the tavern channel.
In the inn, I think, is a better,
the inn?
better place.
We shall go to the inn then. It's different to the tavern. I guess a different kind of beer served there or something.
It's got the better buffs.
See you there in around about a minute, folks. Thanks, everybody, for watching.